A little girl looked at a boy nobody wanted and asked her father 4 words that changed everything. He was a broken orphan with scars on his back and rage in his eyes. She was a woman on the run, hunted by a man who owned the law. And he, a hardened gunfighter who'd buried his heart long ago, somehow became the last wall standing between all of them and total destruction. Today's story reminds us the bravest thing a person can do is choose love over fear and call a stranger family. Welcome to our channel, where every story carries the spirit of the Wild West. If that moves your heart, hit like, drop a comment, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you never miss a story that matters.
The late August heat in Caldwell, Kansas was the kind that baked the earth to cracked pottery and left the taste of grit lingering on the back of a man's tongue. Silas Thorne hoisted a 50-pound sack of flour into the bed of his buckboard wagon with a muted grunt, the muscles in his back pulling tight beneath his sweat-dampened cotton shirt. He slapped the dust from his leather work gloves and turned to the little girl sitting patiently on the wagon bench. "That's the last of it, little bird," Silas said, his low, gravelly voice softening only for her. 6-year-old Daisy smiled around a peppermint stick, her blonde braids swinging. "Can we go home now, Dad?" "Right after I tie off this tarp." Before Silas could reach for the hemp rope, a long, piercing shriek tore through the sweltering afternoon air. The ground beneath Silas's boots began to vibrate. Down at the end of Main Street, a massive locomotive cut through the heat haze. It pulled into the Caldwell depot with a deafening hiss of pressurized steam and the violent screech of iron brakes belching a thick cloud of black coal smoke that temporarily blotted out the sun. Silas's jaw tightened. He didn't need to see the banners draped across the passenger cars to know what this was. The orphan train. "Look!" Daisy pointed, standing up on the bench. "Sit down, Daisy," Silas said, quicker and sharper than he meant to. He pulled his Stetson low over his brow. "It's just a train. We've got a long ride back to the Broken Spur." But the town was already migrating toward the depot. Men stepping out of the saloon, women abandoning their mercantile shopping, all flocking to the platform, with that unmistakable blend of civic curiosity and quiet judgment. Silas tried to focus on his knots, but the phantom ache in his chest was flaring up. He knew the smell of that coal dust. He knew the terror of stepping off a train into a sea of assessing, calculating eyes. 22 years ago, a boy with no name and no boots had stood on a platform just like that one, praying to God someone would pick him. God hadn't answered, so that boy had picked up a gun instead. "Dad," Daisy said. She wasn't looking at the wagon anymore. She was staring past him through the dissipating smoke, straight at the depot platform. Silas made the mistake of turning around. An agent in a cheap wool suit was barking over the noise of the crowd, parading a dozen children out of the train cars. Most of them were crying. They huddled together like a flock of terrified sheep, clutching battered cloth dolls or the hems of their siblings' shirts. But there was one who didn't huddle. He stood at the far edge of the wooden platform, deliberately separated from the rest. He was maybe 13, swimming in a man's discarded shirt that had been roughly hemmed at the sleeves. A fading, ugly yellow bruise shadowed his sharp jawline. But it was his posture that caught Silas's eye. The boy stood with his arms crossed tightly over his narrow chest, his chin tilted up in a silent, bitter dare. His dark eyes scanned the crowd, not with hope, but with the cold, assessing glare of a cornered predator. He wasn't looking for a family. He was looking for a threat. Daisy tugged on Silas's sleeve. 2 short pulls, 1 long. Silas looked down at his daughter. Her bright blue eyes were wide, fixed on the boy at the end of the line. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cutting through the noise of the bustling street. "Can we bring him home?" The 4 words hit Silas like a physical blow. A bullet to the ribs would have been a cleaner pain. "Daisy," Silas started, his throat suddenly tight. He's not a stray dog, and the broken spur doesn't need another hand. It's just you and me." "But Dad," Daisy said, pointing a sticky, peppermint-stained finger toward the platform, "nobody wants him." Silas looked back. The placement agent was successfully matching the crying, compliant children with local farmers. The dark-haired boy remained untouched. A couple approached him, but the boy leveled such a chilling, venomous glare at them that the woman actually took a step back, pulling her husband away. The boy's jaw clenched. He looked down at his scuffed boots, the mask of defiance slipping just enough to reveal the crushing, exhausted despair underneath. Silas felt the scars on his own back twinge. He knew that look. It was the look of a boy who had already calculated the exact moment the world was going to throw him away. Damn it, Silas thought. He didn't make a conscious decision. His boots just started moving. He crossed the dusty street, his spurs chiming a low metallic rhythm that parted the crowd. He stopped squarely in front of the placement agent. The agent looked up, intimidated by Silas's broad shoulders and the cold, unyielding set of his jaw. "Can I help you, mister?" "The boy on the end," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm taking him." The agent glanced at the boy, then grimaced. "Listen, friend, I ought to warn you. That's Levi. He's been placed twice since St. Louis and returned both times. They say he's got a wicked temper, incorrigible, doesn't take to authority." "I didn't ask for his resume," Silas said, pulling a pen from the agent's inkwell. "Where do I sign?" The boy, Levi, snapped his head up. He stared at Silas, his dark eyes wide with shock, before the heavy defensive armor slammed back into place. The transaction took less than 3 minutes. Silas didn't try to make small talk. He just gestured to the wagon. Levi grabbed a small canvas sack, everything he owned in the world, and marched to the buckboard. He climbed into the back, wedging himself as far away from Daisy and Silas as the wooden siding would allow. The 9-mile ride back to the Broken Spur Ranch was completed in total suffocating silence. By the time they arrived, the sun had dipped below the western bluffs, painting the vast Kansas sky in bruised shades of purple and black. Silas showed Levi to a small room off the kitchen. It was sparse, a narrow iron bed, a wash basin, and a kerosene lamp, but it was clean. "Supper is at 6, Silas told the boy, standing in the doorway. "If you're hungry, eat. If you're tired, sleep. We start work at dawn." Levi didn't say a word. He just stood in the center of the room, clutching his canvas sack, staring at Silas like he expected the man to strike him. Silas sighed, closed the door, and walked away. Hours later, the ranch house was dead quiet. The midnight wind howled around the eaves of the wraparound porch. Silas sat at his desk in the parlor, a glass of untouched whiskey beside his accounting ledgers. He couldn't focus. A heavy, nagging instinct, a remnant from his days surviving the gunsmoke of his youth, crawled up the back of his neck. He stood up, his footsteps utterly silent on the hardwood floor, and walked down the hall to Levi's room. Silas didn't knock. He eased the door open just an inch, letting the pale moonlight spill into the pitch-black room. The iron bed was perfectly made. Empty. Silas's pulse spiked. He pushed the door open further, his eyes adjusting to the dark, scanning the room for an open window or a missing boy. Then he saw him. Levi hadn't run. He was wedged into the sharpest, darkest corner of the room, his knees pulled tight to his chest, his back pressed hard against the intersecting walls so no one could sneak up behind him. He was wide awake, his breathing shallow and rapid. And in his right hand, gripped so tightly his knuckles were bone-white in the moonlight, was the heavy 10-inch steel butcher knife missing from Silas's kitchen. The boy's eyes were fixed on the doorway. He didn't look like a child who had just found a home. He looked like a soldier in enemy territory, weapon drawn, waiting in the dark for the monsters to finally come. The morning sun over the Broken Spur Ranch didn't rise so much as it bled across the horizon, a raw, burning crimson that promised another day of relentless heat. Silas hadn't mentioned the butcher knife. When Levi finally emerged from his room, defensive and hollow-eyed, Silas had simply pointed to a plate of bacon and eggs on the heavy oak table, poured a cup of black coffee, and walked out to the barn. He knew how feral things worked. You didn't corner them, and you didn't force them to eat from your hand. You just left the gate open and waited. By mid-morning, Silas put Levi to work. It was a simple task, splitting a cord of seasoned oak behind the woodshed, while Silas repaired a rotted porch railing. It took less than an hour for the boy to spring his trap. Crack! The sharp, unnatural sound of splintering wood echoed across the dusty yard. Silas set down his hammer and walked slowly toward the shed. Levi was standing over the chopping block, his chest heaving. At his feet lay the heavy iron axe head, detached from its shattered hickory handle. The boy had deliberately overswung, driving the wooden haft directly into the edge of the chopping block with enough brute force to snap it cleanly in two. Levi's shoulders were braced, drawn up to his ears. His hands were curled into tight fists at his sides, and his dark eyes were locked on Silas's heavy leather boots. He was waiting for the explosion. He was waiting for the backhand, the shout, the inevitable command to pack his miserable canvas sack and get off the property. He had forced the issue, trying to prove that the quiet, steady man who brought him here was just a liar waiting for an excuse to turn violent. Silas looked at the broken axe handle. Then he looked at the boy. He could see the slight tremor in Levi's rigid jaw. Silas calmly reached down and picked up the splintered wood. "Hickory is tough," he said, his voice a low, even rumble. "But it ain't invincible." Levi blinked, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "I broke it." "I see that. I ruined it." Levi's voice rose, edged with a frantic, desperate provocation. "It's busted good." Silas tossed the broken pieces onto the scrap pile and picked up the heavy iron axe head. "Then we'll fix it. Go into the barn. Above the tack trunk there's a rack of spare handles and a jar of steel wedges. Bring them out here and I'll show you how to seat a new haft." Levi stared at him, utterly disarmed. The script in his head had been torn to shreds. You ain't gonna whip me?" Something dark and dangerous flickered in Silas's eyes. A ghost of the man he used to be. But he suppressed it instantly. He stepped closer, dropping his voice so it was nothing but a quiet, immovable truth. "A man who raises a hand to a child is a coward, Levi. There are no cowards on the broken spur. Fetch the handle." Levi swallowed hard, his armor cracking just a fraction, before he turned and bolted toward the barn. By noon, they were in the buckboard wagon heading into Caldwell. Silas needed nails for the porch, a new jar of wedges, and peppermint sticks for Daisy, who was sitting happily between the two silent males. The Caldwell Mercantile was a cavernous, dimly lit sanctuary that smelled of oiled floorboards, roasted coffee beans, and dried leather. Silas pushed the heavy wooden door open, the brass bell jingling above. "Silas Thorne," a crisp, melodic voice called out from behind the long wooden counter. "I was beginning to think you'd decided to let that porch of yours rot completely away." Abigail Stanton stood wiping her hands on a clean white apron. She was 28, with rich auburn hair pinned sensibly at the nape of her neck, though a few rebellious strands had escaped to frame a face that could stop a clock. She possessed a sharp, intelligent beauty, but there was a guarded wariness in her hazel eyes, the look of a woman who kept her true thoughts locked in a vault. She was the town's new school teacher, supplementing her meager income by managing the Mercantile's books and inventory. Silas touched the brim of his Stetson, feeling an unwelcome, familiar pull in his chest. Abby Stanton was the only woman in Caldwell who could make his pulse shift gears. "Miss Stanton, some of us actually work for a living, rather than standing behind a counter judging those who do." Abby smiled, a genuine dazzling thing that didn't quite reach the defensive shadows in her eyes. 10 pounds of nails, Silas? Make it 15. And some coffee." While Abby weighed the nails, her gaze shifted to the boy standing awkwardly near the barrels of salted pork. Levi was staring intensely at a brightly colored advertisement for patent medicine tacked to the wall. "That's a new shadow you've got there, Silas," Abby noted quietly, pouring the heavy iron nails into a canvas sack. "This is Levi," Silas said. Abby wiped her hands and walked out from behind the counter. She approached Levi with the slow, deliberate movements one might use to approach a skittish Mustang. "Hello, Levi. I'm Miss Stanton. Do you like reading?" she asked, nodding toward the poster. Levi flinched, stepping back. He scowled, his defense mechanism instantly deploying. "Don't need it. It's just stupid marks on paper." Abby didn't patronize him. Her eyes simply tracked his gaze, noting how his brow had furrowed not in concentration, but in frustration. He hadn't been reading the poster. He had been trying to decode it, and failing. "It's only stupid until it's useful," Abby said mildly. She turned back to Silas, her hazel eyes locking onto his. "He ought to be in my classroom next week when the term starts." Silas shook his head. "He's not ready for a room full of town kids, Abby. They'd chew him up or he'd put one of them through a window. He's got too much anger in him right now." Abby leaned against the counter, closing the distance between them. Silas could smell the faint scent of lilac water and ink on her skin. "Then let me come to him," she said, her voice dropping to a private, urgent register. "Tuesdays and Thursdays, after the mercantile closes, I'll ride out to the Broken Spur. An hour of letters and numbers." Silas frowned, his protective instincts flaring. "The Broken Spur is a working cattle ranch, Miss Stanton. It's dusty, it's rough, and it's no place for a school teacher in the evening." "I'm tougher than I look, Mr. Thorne," Abby shot back, her chin tilting up. For a second, Silas saw a flash of steel in her eyes, a survivor's grit that matched his own. "He's drowning in dry dirt, Silas. I can see it. Let me throw him a rope." Silas stared down at her. He knew he should say no. Keeping a woman like Abigail Stanton at arm's length was the safest bet for his deeply buried heart. But he looked over at Levi, who was now staring miserably at his boots. Silas exhaled a long, defeated breath. "Supper is at 6. Don't expect fancy cooking." Abby's lips curved into a triumphant, breathtaking smile. "I'll bring the books. You just make sure the coffee is strong." True to her word, Abigail rode up the dusty drive of the Broken Spur at 5:30 on Tuesday evening. Silas was in the round pen working a Greenbroke roan gelding. Abby tied her mare to the hitching post and stood by the fence for a long moment, simply watching him. Silas moved with a fluid, dangerous grace, his broad chest rising and falling, his muscles flexing beneath his sweat-soaked shirt as he murmured low, calming words to the panicked animal. He was a man composed entirely of hard lines and quiet strength, and watching him made a strange, forgotten heat bloom in Abby's chest. Shaking herself from the dangerous reverie, she gathered her slate and primers from her saddlebag. "Where's my new student?" she called out. Silas tipped his hat, not taking his eyes off the horse. "Out by the pump. Told him to wash the stable muck off before he sat down with a lady." Abby smiled and made her way around the side of the weathered farmhouse. The rhythmic squeak of the cast-iron water pump echoed in the quiet evening air. "Levi?" she called out softly, not wanting to startle him. "I brought the books." Levi was bent over the wooden trough beneath the pump. He had stripped off his oversized shirt to wash the sweat and dirt from his torso. The boy froze at the sound of her voice, his hands slick with lye soap. Abby stepped around the corner of the house, holding a clean linen towel she'd pulled from her bag. "I thought you might need a—" The words died in her throat. The towel slipped from her numb fingers, landing softly in the dust. The late golden sunlight hit Levi's bare back, illuminating a horrific tapestry of violence. The boy's pale skin was marred by dozens of jagged silver scars. They crisscrossed over his shoulder blades and down his spine in a brutal, chaotic web. But it wasn't just the sheer number of scars that made all the blood drain from Abby's face. It was the shape of them. At the end of 3 of the thickest, deepest lash marks, the scar tissue formed a distinct, jagged hook, a tear made by a small piece of barbed wire braided into the tip of a leather bullwhip. Abby's breath hitched, a cold, suffocating terror gripping her lungs. She took a stumbling step backward, her hand flying to her mouth. She knew that mark. She knew the exact whip that made it, and she knew the monster who wielded it. It was the signature cruelty of Elias Montgomery's chief enforcer. Levi spun around, snatching his shirt from the pump handle and yanking it over his head, his face burning with a mixture of profound shame and furious anger. "Stop looking at me," he snarled. But Abby couldn't speak. She stared at the terrified, broken boy, the horrific realization crashing down on her like a collapsed roof. Levi hadn't just been abused by some random, cruel foster family. He had been in the hands of Elias Montgomery's men. And if Montgomery's men had their claws in this boy, it meant the shadow Abby had run 500 miles to escape had just found its way to the broken spur. The metallic snip of wire cutters was a sound that didn't belong in the deep, velvet quiet of a prairie night. Silas heard it just past 2 in the morning, a sound carrying on the dry wind sweeping down from the northern ridge. He was out of bed, boots pulled on, and his Colt Peacemaker strapped to his thigh before his brain fully registered the waking world. He found Levi already standing in the hallway, a makeshift wooden club clutched in his hands. The boy was trembling, not from fear, but from an adrenaline-fueled rage. He had heard it too. "Put the stick down," Silas said quietly, grabbing a coil of barbed wire and a pair of heavy leather gloves from the mudroom. "Get your boots, we've got work to do." They rode out to the western boundary under a sky scattered with diamond dust. A quarter-mile of the broken spur's fence line lay in ruins. The thick cedar posts had been dragged down, and the heavy strands of barbed wire were snipped into useless, curled fragments. Beyond the broken barrier, the vast, dark emptiness of the open range threatened to swallow Silas's cattle. Silas didn't curse. He didn't scream into the night. He simply dismounted, tied his gelding to a surviving post, and handed Levi a pair of thick leather gloves. "Grab the tensioner," Silas ordered, his voice flat and calm. For the next 4 hours, they worked in grueling, agonizing darkness. The rusted barbs tore at their denim and bit into their forearms. Sweat stung Silas's eyes as he muscled the heavy posts back into the unyielding earth. Levi worked beside him, panting, his narrow shoulders straining against the heavy iron tool used to pull the wire taut. Around 4 in the morning, Levi's grip slipped. The wire whipped back, a rusted barb slicing a shallow gash across the back of the boy's hand. Levi hissed, dropping the tool. He stepped back, clutching his bleeding hand, his chest heaving. He stared at Silas, waiting for the reprimand for being careless, for slowing the work down. Silas simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a clean cotton handkerchief and tossed it to the boy. "Wrap it tight. Keep pressure on it." Levi bound his hand, his dark eyes wide and searching in the moonlight. "Why are we doing this?" he finally snapped, the question tearing out of his throat. "They're just going to come back and cut it again. Why don't you just let 'em have it? Why don't you just run?" Silas paused, leaning his weight against a cedar post. He looked at the boy, really looked at him. Levi's worldview was entirely shaped by men who broke things and men who ran away. "Because a man's life is measured by the ground he refuses to give up," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, steady timbre. "You run once, Levi, and you'll spend the rest of your life running. This is my land. This is Daisy's home. Nobody takes it in the dark." Levi stared at him, the concept entirely foreign, yet desperately appealing. He looked at the broken fence, then down at his bleeding hand. Without another word, he picked up the tensioner, gripping it over the bloody handkerchief, and leaned his weight back into the wire. Silas watched him for a second, feeling a profound shift in the air between them. He's a fighter, Silas thought. He just never had anything worth fighting for. By the time Abigail Stanton rode up to the farmhouse at dusk the following evening, her nerves were completely frayed. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the horrific, jagged scars on Levi's back. She knew the man who employed the whip that made those marks. Elias Montgomery. the ruthless, untouchable land baron she had fled across 3 state lines to escape. If Montgomery's men were operating in Caldwell, her borrowed time was running out. But as she tied her mare to the hitching post, she forced a calm, warm smile onto her face. She carried a heavy cast-iron pot of beef stew wrapped in a towel, the rich, savory smell preceding her. "Miss Abby!" Daisy cheered from the porch, running to hug the schoolteacher's skirts. "Hello, little bird," Abby laughed, smoothing the girl's blonde hair. The tutoring session took place at the heavy oak dining table. Levi was exhausted from the night's labor, his bandaged hand clumsy as he held the chalk, but his attitude had shifted. The overt hostility was gone, replaced by a quiet, determined focus. He wanted to prove to Silas, who sat quietly in the corner armchair mending a bridle, that he wasn't useless. "Let's try spelling your name again," Abby said patiently, guiding his hand over the slate. Levi gritted his teeth, his brow furrowed in fierce concentration. Slowly, deliberately, he scratched out 4 jagged, uneven letters. Levi. He stopped, staring at the slate. A strange, breathless expression crossed his face. For the first time in his life, he existed on paper. He looked up, his dark eyes meeting Silas's across the room. Silas stopped his mending. He gave the boy a single, firm nod of approval. It was a microscopic gesture, but Levi's chest swelled as if he'd just been handed a gold medal. Later, when Daisy was tucked into bed and Levi had retreated to his room with a primer, Abby stepped out onto the wraparound porch. The Kansas night was expansive and cool, the sky a sea of crushed velvet and brilliant stars. Silas followed her out, handing her a tin cup of steaming black coffee. "He's a smart boy, Silas," Abby said softly, wrapping her hands around the warm tin. "He just needs someone to believe he's worth the time." Silas leaned against the wooden porch pillar, his tall, imposing frame casting a long shadow in the moonlight. He studied her profile, the elegant slope of her nose, the heavy exhaustion weighing down her hazel eyes. "You looked like you saw a ghost yesterday by the pump," Silas observed quietly, his voice a gravelly murmur that sent a shiver down Abby's spine. Abby's grip tightened on the cup. She looked out at the dark horizon. "Some ghosts don't stay buried, Mr. Thorne. Sometimes you think you've outrun them, only to find they've been walking right behind you the whole time." "Silas," he corrected gently, "if you're going to teach my boy and feed my family, you might as well call me Silas." Abby turned her head, looking up at him. The physical proximity between them suddenly felt charged, the air thick and heavy. "My husband died 3 years ago," she whispered, offering a half-truth to protect him from the dangerous reality. "But the men he was involved with, they were cruel. They left marks on people, like the ones on Levi's back." Silas's jaw hardened at the mention of the scars. His eyes darkened with a sudden, fierce, protective instinct. He reached out, his calloused, rough fingers gently brushing a stray lock of auburn hair away from her cheek. His touch was shockingly tender for a man with such violent hands. "Whoever they were," Silas said, his voice dropping to a raw, intimate vow, "they aren't here. And if they ever come looking, they'll have to go through me." Abby's breath hitched. She looked into his eyes and saw a man who had walked through hell and come out forged in iron. For the first time in years, she felt dangerously, terrifyingly safe. The illusion of safety shattered before the sun even crested the horizon. Silas stepped out onto the porch the next morning, a cup of coffee in his hand, the cool dawn air biting at his lungs. He stopped dead in his tracks. The coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering against the wooden floorboards. Sprawled across the bottom step of the porch was a slaughtered black Angus calf. Its throat had been brutally slashed, thick, dark blood pooling in the dust and soaking into the hem of the wooden stairs. But it wasn't just a mindless act of vandalism. Driven deep into the wooden porch post, right at eye level, was a heavy silver-hilted Bowie knife. Pinned beneath the razor-sharp blade was a piece of blood-smeared parchment. Silas's heart hammered against his ribs as he stepped over the carcass and wrenched the knife from the wood. He unfolded the stiff paper. The crude, jagged handwriting wasn't a threat about the ranch or the water rights. It read, "Montgomery collects his debts. Tell the Stanton woman her time is up. Blood is a stubborn thing to wash out of dry pine." Before the sun had even crested the ridge, Silas Thorne had hauled the slaughtered calf to the brush pile, buried it deep, and scrubbed the porch steps with lye and boiling water. He worked in furious, methodical silence. He didn't want Daisy to see the gore. He didn't want Levi to smell the coppery scent of death that lingered in the cool morning air. Most of all, he didn't want them to see the look in his own eyes. Silas stood at the pump, washing the pale pink suds from his calloused hands. The crumpled, blood-smeared note was currently burning to ash in the belly of the cast-iron kitchen stove. "Tell the Stanton woman her time is up." His blood ran cold, then hot. Elias Montgomery wasn't just a greedy land baron squeezing local ranchers. He was a predator who enjoyed the hunt, and he had tracked Abigail Stanton to Caldwell. Silas strode into the kitchen, his jaw set like carved granite. Levi was sitting at the table, clumsily trying to butter a piece of toast with his bandaged hand. The boy looked up, his dark eyes instantly catching the dangerous coiled tension radiating off the rancher. "Levi," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly command that brooked no argument. "Load my shotgun. Keep it behind the kitchen door. You don't open this house for anyone but me. You watch Daisy." Levi dropped the butter knife. He didn't ask questions. He recognized the tone of a man preparing for war. He gave a single sharp nod. "Yes, sir." Silas saddled his fastest gelding and rode the 9 miles to Caldwell at a breakneck gallop. The dust hadn't even settled in the street when he threw his reins over the hitching post outside the Mercantile. He pushed through the heavy wooden doors. The bell jingled merrily, a sickening contrast to the dread gnawing at Silas's gut. Abby was on a small stepladder, arranging tins of peaches on a high shelf. She turned, a warm, genuine smile breaking across her face at the sight of him. "Silas, I didn't expect you until—" "Get down!" Silas interrupted, crossing the floor in 3 long strides. Abby's smile vanished. She stepped down from the ladder, her hazel eyes scanning his face. She saw the dust caked on his clothes, the wild protective fire in his pale eyes, and the way his right hand hovered instinctively near the heavy Colt peacemaker strapped to his thigh. "Silas, what's wrong?" He didn't sugarcoat it. He couldn't afford to. He stepped close, lowering his voice so the few patrons in the back of the store couldn't hear. "A dead calf was left on my porch this morning. Pinned to it was a note from Elias Montgomery. He knows you're here, Abby, and he knows you're connected to me." All the color drained from Abby's face. She stumbled back a half step, her spine hitting the wooden shelves. Her hand flew to her throat as the suffocating nightmare she had run 3 states to escape finally caught up to her. No, he couldn't have. I changed my name. I covered my tracks." "He has men everywhere, Abby. The kind of men who leave scars on boys like Levi," Silas said softly, the harshness leaving his voice as he saw her terror. He reached out, his large, rough hands gently gripping her trembling shoulders. "Pack a bag. You're coming to the Broken Spur. Now." "Silas, I can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "If I go with you, I bring his wrath down on your home. He'll burn your ranch to the ground. I have to run. I have to get on the afternoon train." "You aren't running anymore," Silas vowed, his grip tightening just enough to anchor her to the earth. "I am not going to let him touch you. Do you hear me? You are coming home with me." The word home cracked Abby's heart wide open. She looked up into his fierce, unyielding eyes, and for the first time in her life, she surrendered the weight of her survival to someone else. By nightfall, Abby's meager belongings were tucked into the spare room down the hall from Silas. A tense, hyper-vigilant domesticity settled over the Broken Spur. Silas patrolled the perimeter twice a night. He slept lightly in the armchair by the front window, his Winchester rifle resting across his lap. Yet, within the fortified walls of the farmhouse, a strange and beautiful warmth began to bloom. With Abby living under the same roof, Levi's tutoring sessions became daily. 2 nights later, they sat around the warm glow of the kerosene lamp on the dining table. Levi's brow was furrowed, his tongue poking out the corner of his mouth as he meticulously scratched chalk across his slate. Silas was at his desk in the corner, ostensibly balancing his ledgers, but his eyes kept drifting to the table. "Sound it out, Levi," Abby encouraged gently, her auburn hair catching the golden light. "H. O. Levi muttered, frustration tightening his jaw. "Home. It spells home." "That's exactly right," Abby beamed, her pride radiating across the room. Levi looked down at the word. A small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of his bruised mouth. He looked up, catching Silas watching him. The boy didn't scowl, he didn't look away. He just held the slate up so Silas could see it. Silas gave him a slow, deep nod. "Good work, son." The word son hung in the air, heavy and unspoken, sealing something permanent between them. Levi swallowed hard, quickly wiping the slate clean to hide the sudden, fierce sheen of moisture in his eyes. Abby caught Silas's gaze over the boy's head. The raw, unfiltered affection passing between the hardened rancher and the battered schoolteacher was electric. Abby was seeing the man beneath the grit, a man who could clean a six-shooter blindfolded, but who also possessed the agonizing gentleness required to piece a broken boy back together. But Elias Montgomery wasn't a man who allowed peace to flourish. The next afternoon, Silas and Levi rode out to the eastern pasture to check the herd. The Kansas heat was brutal, the air shimmering in waves above the prairie grass. As they crested a low rise, Silas pulled his gelding to a hard stop. The sound was missing. The low, steady babble of Willow Creek, the lifeblood of the Broken Spur's eastern grazing land, was gone. Silas spurred his horse down the embankment. The creek bed was nothing but cracked, sun-baked mud. A few dying fish flopped weakly in a shrinking, muddy puddle. "Where did the water go?" Levi asked, reining his horse in beside Silas. Silas looked upstream, his eyes narrowing at the distant tree line where his property met the vast acreage recently bought up by Montgomery. "He damned it, choked it off at the property line." Levi's face flushed with immediate explosive fury. "He can't do that. Our cows will die. We have to go tear it down." "If we cross his property line and destroy his dam, it's destruction of private property," Silas said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "He'll have the county sheriff arrest me by nightfall, and the bank will seize the Broken Spur." "So we just let him win?" Levi shouted, his fists white-knuckling his reins. The injustice of it triggered every agonizing memory of his helpless past. "Why don't you just ride over there and shoot him? You have the gun. You know how to use it." Silas turned his horse, walking it slowly toward the boy. He stopped so close their stirrups brushed. He looked deep into Levi's furious, desperate eyes. "Because any fool can pull a trigger, Levi," Silas said, the heavy weight of his dark past bleeding into every word. "Killing a man is easy. Living with the ghost of him is the hardest thing you'll ever do. Montgomery wants me to come over that ridge with a gun. He wants a war. But my job isn't to kill him. My job is to protect you, Daisy and Abby. We don't play his game. We haul water from the main well. We survive." Levi stared at him, his chest heaving. The logic made sense, but the anger inside the boy was a wild, thrashing thing. He couldn't understand how Silas could be so strong, yet refused to strike back. That night, the wind howled across the plains, rattling the window panes of the farmhouse. Silas was a light sleeper, trained by years of violence to wake at the snap of a twig. But it wasn't a noise that woke him at 3 in the morning. It was an absence, a strange, hollow shift in the atmosphere of the house. He opened his eyes in the dark parlor. He sat up, his instincts screaming. He looked toward the fireplace mantel. The iron pegs were empty. His Winchester repeating rifle was gone. Silas's blood turned to ice. He vaulted out of the chair and moved silently down the hall. He pushed open the door to Levi's room. The bed was perfectly made. The canvas sack was gone. Silas didn't wake Abby. He sprinted out the back door and across the moonlit yard to the barn. The heavy wooden doors were ajar. He stepped inside, his chest tightening with a cold, absolute dread. The stall housing his fastest, meanest quarter horse was standing wide open. Levi hadn't run away out of fear. The boy had taken the gun, taken the horse, and ridden out into the dark to fix the injustice the only way his battered heart knew how. He had gone to face Elias Montgomery's men alone. The Kansas night was a black ocean, and Silas Thorne rode through it like a man possessed. He pushed his black gelding to a lathered gallop, the freezing wind tearing at his coat. He didn't ride east toward the dammed creek. He had knelt in the dirt outside the barn and read the hoofprints in the moonlight. Levi hadn't ridden for the water. The boy had turned the quarter horse north, straight toward the belly of the beast, Caldwell. Silas's chest felt like it was banded in iron. Levi was 13 years old, riding into a town owned by Elias Montgomery, carrying a Winchester he barely knew how to cock, let alone fire. The boy was trying to repay a debt he didn't owe, marching straight into a slaughterhouse to prove he was worth keeping. "Hold on, son," Silas prayed to a God he hadn't spoken to in a decade. "Just hold on." It was past 3 in the morning when the dark, jagged silhouette of Caldwell rose against the starry horizon. Silas dismounted a quarter-mile out, tying his heaving horse to a scrub oak. He moved the rest of the way on foot, melting into the deep shadows of the alleys, becoming the phantom he used to be. Main Street was dead quiet, save for the hollow rattle of a loose saloon shutter. Silas crept toward the 2-story brick building that housed the assayer's office and Montgomery's private quarters. A sharp, metallic clatter echoed from the alleyway behind the building. Silas froze. He drew his Colt peacemaker, his thumb resting heavily on the hammer. He moved soundlessly along the brick wall, peering around the corner into the moonlit alley. Levi was backed against a stack of wooden shipping crates. He was clutching Silas's heavy Winchester rifle, his small, trembling hands struggling to level the long barrel. 3 men formed a loose semicircle around him. Silas recognized the man in the center immediately. Cullen, a vicious, scarred enforcer who did Montgomery's bloodiest work. Cullen had his revolver drawn, pointing it lazily at Levi's chest. The other 2 men were laughing, a cruel, grating sound in the dark. "Look at this," Cullen sneered, taking a slow step forward. "The stray rat from the broken spur thinks he's a real cowboy. You broke a window, boy. Mr. Montgomery doesn't like it when trash breaks his windows." "Get back!" Levi's voice cracked, high and terrified, but his grip on the rifle didn't slip. "I'll shoot you. I swear to God I will." "That safety's on, kid," one of the other men chuckled, drawing his own gun. "You wouldn't even know how to clear it before I put a bullet through your kneecap. Now drop it, before we take you out to the ridge and finish what we started on your back last year." Levi's breath hitched in a raw, ragged sob at the threat. His hands shook violently. He was cornered, outmatched, and about to die. "Drop it," Cullen commanded, his thumb pulling back the hammer of his revolver with a deadly click. "He's not dropping anything." The voice was a low, seismic rumble that seemed to emanate from the shadows themselves. Cullen and his men spun around. Silas stepped out from the darkness of the brick wall, the moonlight cutting across his harsh, angular face. His pale eyes were devoid of humanity, flat and cold as a winter grave. He didn't look like a cattle rancher. He looked like the Grim Reaper in a Stetson. "Thorne," Cullen hissed, a flicker of genuine unease crossing his face. But there were 3 of them, and only one of him. "You just made the biggest mistake of your miserable life, farmer." Cullen's arm jerked up to fire. What happened next was a masterclass in violence so fast the human eye could barely track it. Silas didn't duck. He didn't seek cover. His right hand became a blur. Bang! 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 3 deafening shots ripped through the narrow alley in the space of a single heartbeat, the muzzle flashes painting the brick walls in explosive, strobe-like orange. Cullen screamed as his heavy revolver was violently ripped from his grip, the cylinder shattered into jagged shrapnel by Silas's bullet. The second man howled, dropping to his knees as Silas's second shot blew the steel barrel off his gun, the sheer kinetic impact snapping his wrist. The third man didn't even have time to aim before the peacemaker's third bullet sheared through the wooden grip of his pistol, sending it spinning into the dirt. Silence slammed back into the alley, broken only by the ringing in Levi's ears and the groans of the disarmed men. Silas hadn't killed them. He had surgically, impossibly dismantled them in a fraction of a second. He stood with his Colt leveled, the barrel smoking in the cold air. "If any of you reach for a boot knife," Silas said, his voice deadly quiet over the ringing echo, "I will put the next round through your left eye. Now run." Cullen stared at his ruined hand, his face pale with shock and terror. He looked at Silas, finally realizing exactly who and what he had just crossed. He scrambled backward, clutching his bleeding fingers, and the three men bolted blindly down the alley into the dark. Silas didn't lower his gun until the sound of their boots faded completely. He holstered the peacemaker with a fluid snap and turned to Levi. The boy dropped the Winchester. It clattered against the dirt. Levi slid down the stack of crates, his knees finally giving out, his chest heaving with silent, terrified sobs. Silas crossed the alley in 2 strides. He knelt in the dirt, his massive, calloused hands gripping Levi's shoulders, pulling the trembling boy into a fierce, crushing embrace. "I've got you," Silas breathed into the boy's hair, his own heart hammering against his ribs. "You're safe. I've got you." Levi buried his face in Silas's coat, his small hands fisting in the heavy canvas fabric. He had seen the truth. Silas was a killer. He had the power to destroy anyone he wanted, but he had chosen not to. He had used that terrifying power solely to shield a broken orphan. "We have to go," Silas said gruffly, pulling back and hauling Levi to his feet. He scooped up the dropped Winchester. "Montgomery will have the whole town awake in 10 minutes. Let's ride." They ran through the shadows, reaching the horses just as the first shouts began echoing from Main Street. Silas hoisted Levi onto the saddle of the quarter horse, then mounted his own gelding. They spurred the horses hard, fleeing the town and pushing into the protective cover of the western foothills. They rode for an hour before Silas finally called a halt near a grove of cottonwoods, the first gray light of dawn beginning to bleed across the eastern horizon. Silas dismounted, his adrenaline finally crashing into a wave of profound, exhausted fury. He turned to Levi, pulling the boy down from the saddle. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Silas demanded, his voice cracking like a whip in the quiet dawn. "Do you know how close you came to dying in that dirt? For what? A piece of paper?" Levi stood his ground, though his chin trembled. "He stole our water. I was going to his office to steal the deed back. I was going to fix it so you wouldn't have to lose the ranch because of me." "You listen to me," Silas said, stepping close, his voice thick with raw emotion. "There is not a single acre of dirt on God's green earth worth your life. I don't care about the water. I care about you. If you ever pull a stunt like that again, I will chain you to the porch post. Do you understand me?" Levi stared up at him. The harsh words weren't a rejection. They were a frantic, desperate declaration of love. The boy swallowed hard, reaching a trembling hand inside his oversized, dust-covered shirt. "I didn't find the water paper," Levi whispered, his dark eyes wide in the pale morning light. "The safe was locked. But I found this hidden under a loose floorboard beneath his desk." Levi pulled an object from his shirt and held it out. Silas frowned, taking the heavy object. It was a thick, black leather-bound ledger, the edges worn from heavy use. Silas flipped it open, his eyes scanning the columns of neat, meticulous handwriting. Dates, names, bribes paid to the county sheriff, extortion payments from terrified homesteaders, the exact amounts paid to enforcers to burn out ranchers or poison their wells. It was Elias Montgomery's private accounting book. Silas's breath hitched. He looked up from the pages, staring at the scarred 13-year-old boy standing in the Kansas dirt. Levi hadn't found the deed to the creek. He had found the rope that was going to hang Elias Montgomery. The sun was fully up by the time Silas and Levi rode back into the yard of the Broken Spur. Abigail had been pacing the length of the wraparound porch for 3 hours, a shawl pulled tight over her shoulders despite the climbing heat. When she saw the 2 riders crest the ridge, the breath she had been holding left her in a ragged, trembling sigh. She picked up her skirts, and ran out into the dust to meet them. Silas slid from the saddle, his face gray with exhaustion, the dust of the road caked into the deep lines around his mouth. Before his boots fully hit the ground, Abby threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in the heavy canvas of his coat. Silas stiffened for the fraction of a second, entirely unused to the feeling of someone waiting for him, worrying for him. Then his large hands came up to tentatively, heavily wrap around her waist. "I've got him, Abby," Silas murmured into her auburn hair, the scent of her lilac water cutting through the harsh smell of horse sweat and gun smoke. "We're in one piece." Abby pulled back, her hazel eyes wet, and reached up to help Levi slide down from the quarter horse. The boy looked exhausted, pale, and thoroughly shaken, but he clung to Abby's hand for a moment before stepping back. Inside the safety of the kitchen, Silas dropped the heavy black leather ledger onto the oak table. Abby stared at it as Silas explained what had happened in the alleyway. When he finished, she reached out and gingerly opened the book. She turned the thick yellowed pages, her eyes scanning the meticulous columns of ink. "Bribes to the county land commissioner," Abby whispered, her finger tracing a line. "Payments to the sheriff to look the other way when the Miller Ranch burned down last spring." "Good Lord, Silas. This isn't just a record book, it's a confession." "It's a noose," Silas corrected, leaning heavily against the counter, nursing a cup of black coffee. "But handing it to the local sheriff is as good as throwing it in the river. Montgomery owns the law in Caldwell. We need a federal judge." "Judge Carter rides the circuit," Abby said, her mind racing. "He won't be in the next county over for at least 3 weeks." "Then we hold the ranch for 3 weeks," Silas stated, his jaw setting into a hard, uncompromising line. "Montgomery knows we have it. He knows he can't just send his riders to shoot me in broad daylight without drawing the exact federal attention he's trying to avoid. He's going to come at us another way." Silas's prediction was off by a matter of hours. At high noon, the horizon birthed a thick cloud of yellow dust. Silas saw it from the porch. He didn't reach for his Winchester. He simply unlatched the leather thong, securing his Colt Peacemaker in its holster, and stood on the top step, casting a long, unyielding shadow over the sun-bleached boards. A polished black buggy, entirely out of place on the rugged prairie, rolled into the yard, flanked by 4 mounted riders. One of the riders was Cullen, his shattered left hand heavily wrapped in bloody bandages, his eyes burning with a venomous, humiliated hatred as he glared at Silas. But it was the man who stepped down from the buggy who made the air in the yard go cold. Elias Montgomery did not look like a frontier thug. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, a silk cravat, and a silver pocket watch chain that caught the brutal Kansas sun. He possessed a refined, aristocratic cruelty, his eyes pale and lifeless. Following Montgomery was a nervous, sweating man in a cheap brown suit clutching a leather briefcase. "Mr. Thorne?" Montgomery said, his voice smooth and oiled. He didn't look at the gun on Silas's hip. He looked at the farmhouse behind him. "A lovely piece of land you have here. Pity it's so poorly managed." "Get off my property, Montgomery," Silas rumbled, not moving an inch. "I'm afraid I'm not here on personal business," Montgomery smiled thinly. He gestured to the sweating man beside him. "This is Mr. Sterling. He is the state child welfare inspector for the district, and he has some grave concerns." Sterling stepped forward, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. He cleared his throat, refusing to meet Silas's lethal gaze. "Mr. Thorne, it has been brought to the state's attention that you are harboring a delinquent youth, a boy by the name of Levi." Inside the house, peering through the crack in the heavy oak door, Levi's heart stopped. Abby stood right behind him, her hands resting protectively on his shoulders. "Levi is my ward," Silas said, his voice dangerously soft. "I signed the papers at the depot." "Papers that can be revoked," Sterling said, gaining a fraction of false courage from Montgomery's presence. "The boy was involved in an armed altercation in an alleyway just last night. Blood was shed. Furthermore, the state requires a rehabilitative environment for orphans with violent tendencies. A suitable 2-parent household with a maternal figure to provide moral guidance. You are a widower, Mr. Thorne. A former gunfighter, living in isolation. This is an unfit environment. Silas's hand hovered over the ivory grip of his Colt. Montgomery wasn't trying to take the ranch today. He was trying to take the boy, holding Levi hostage to force Silas to trade the ledger for his son. "You step foot on my porch to take that boy," Silas said, the deadly metallic promise in his voice causing the mounted riders to nervously shift their horses, "and God himself won't be able to put you back together." "Are you threatening a state official, Thorne?" Montgomery purred, triumphant. "Inspector Sterling, make a note of his hostility. I believe we have all the grounds we need to remove the child immediately." The heavy oak front door swung open. Abigail Stanton stepped out onto the porch, the Kansas wind catching the hem of her simple cotton dress. She didn't look like a terrified widow on the run. She stood tall, her chin tilted up, her hazel eyes blazing with a fierce protective fire that made Montgomery's smile falter. "You'll do no such thing, Mr. Sterling," Abby said, her voice ringing clear and authoritative across the dusty yard. Sterling blinked, wiping his brow again. "And who exactly are you, madam?" "I am Abigail Stanton," she declared, stepping up to stand shoulder to shoulder with Silas. She didn't look at him, keeping her fiery gaze fixed entirely on the inspector. "I am the town school teacher, and I am Silas Thorne's fiancée. This home has a maternal figure, and it will very shortly be a two-parent household." Silas went entirely still, every muscle in his body locked. He didn't dare breathe, let alone look at the woman standing beside him, throwing herself directly into the line of fire to save a boy she had known for barely 2 weeks. Montgomery's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. He recognized her. He recognized the name, and he recognized the defiance of a woman his men had once terrorized 3 states away. The realization that Silas's weakness and his own escaped prey were one and the same flickered across his cold face. Inspector Sterling scoffed, a nervous, ugly sound. "A convenient fiction, Miss Stanton. I don't see a ring. I don't see wedding bands posted in the town square. You expect the state to believe you are engaged to this ruffian?" "I don't care what the state believes," Abby fired back, her heart hammering against her ribs, terrifyingly aware of the precipice she had just stepped off. "I care what the law dictates, and the law says you cannot remove a child from an impending stable marriage without an investigation." "Words," Sterling sneered, emboldened. "Just words from a desperate woman. I need proof of this so-called devotion, or the boy comes with us." Silas didn't think. The primal possessive instinct that had been roaring in his blood since the moment Abby arrived on his ranch finally snapped its chain. He turned, his large, calloused hand reaching out to grip the nape of Abby's neck. He pulled her flush against his chest, his other arm wrapping tightly around her waist, and brought his mouth down on hers. It was supposed to be a performance, a calculated lie to satisfy a corrupt official. But the second Silas's lips touched hers, the lie incinerated. Abby gasped against his mouth, her hands flying up to grip the lapels of his dusty canvas coat. Silas kissed her with a desperate, starved intensity, pouring years of agonizing loneliness, unspoken fear, and raw, violent protection into the claiming of her mouth. The taste of him, black coffee, leather, and something entirely male and intoxicating, sent a shockwave straight to Abby's core. She didn't freeze. She surrendered. Her fingers tangled in the hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer, her mouth opening beneath his in a genuine, earth-shattering response that made the rest of the world vanish. For 5 agonizingly long, breathless seconds, there was no corrupt inspector. There was no ruthless land baron. There was only the blistering, undeniable truth of the fire burning between them. When Silas finally pulled back, both of them were breathing heavily, their chests heaving, their eyes locked in a dazed, electrified shock. Silas's thumb gently brushed the swollen curve of her lower lip before he slowly, deliberately turned his head back to the men in the yard. His pale eyes were lethal. "If you ever question my fiancé's word again," Silas rumbled, the sheer territorial menace in his voice echoing off the barn, "I will cut your tongue out." Sterling swallowed audibly, taking a rapid step backward until his spine hit the buggy. He looked at Montgomery, panicked. Montgomery's face was a mask of cold, vibrating fury. The fake engagement had outmaneuvered him, exploiting the very bureaucratic rules he had tried to weaponize. He couldn't legally take the boy today without causing a scene that might draw federal eyes before he could secure the ledger. "Very well," Sterling stammered, pulling himself up into the buggy. He pointed a trembling finger at Silas. "But the law has a timeline, Thorne. The state does not recognize eternal engagements. If there is no legal wedding ceremony documented in the county courthouse in 30 days, the grace period expires. I will return, and I will take the boy." Montgomery signaled his riders. As the buggy turned around in the dirt, the Baron leveled one last chilling look at Silas, and then shifted his dead eyes to Abby. 30 days is a long time in the West, Miss Stanton," Montgomery called out smoothly over the sound of the wheels. "Fires break out, tragedies occur. Make sure you don't burn yourself before the wedding day." The buggy rolled out of the yard, leaving a suffocating cloud of dust in its wake. Silas stood on the porch, his chest rising and falling, the ghost of Abby's taste still burning on his lips. He slowly turned to face her. Abby stared back at him, her cheeks flushed crimson, her hazel eyes wide and terrified by the monumental, irreversible lie she had just bound them to. They had 30 days to destroy Elias Montgomery, or they would lose Levi, the ranch, and their lives. The dust from Montgomery's buggy had long settled, but the air on the porch of the broken spur still hummed with the electric aftermath of the kiss. Silas stood frozen, his chest rising and falling heavily. He looked down at Abigail Stanton. Her lips were slightly swollen, parted in a soft, shocked gasp, and her hazel eyes were wide and entirely stripped of their usual guarded composure. "You shouldn't have done that," Silas finally rasped, his voice a gravelly, abrasive scrape against the silence. "You just painted a target on your back the size of Kansas." "He was going to take Levi," Abby shot back, her voice trembling, but her chin lifting in that defiant way that made Silas's chest tighten. "I couldn't let them drag him back to that nightmare." A fake engagement was the only legal maneuver that corrupt inspector couldn't immediately overrule. The heavy oak door creaked open. Levi stepped out onto the porch, his face pale with Daisy peeking out from behind his legs. The boy looked from Silas to Abby, his dark eyes fiercely assessing the situation. "Are you really getting married?" Daisy piped up, her blue eyes wide with innocent, unfiltered joy. "Are you going to be my new mama, Miss Abby?" Abby's heart broke a little at the raw hope in the little girl's voice. She knelt down, smoothing Daisy's blonde braids, her hands shaking slightly. It's a grown-up plan, sweetie. To keep Levi safe. To keep all of us safe." Levi didn't say anything, but he looked up at Silas. The 13-year-old had seen enough of the world's ugly realities to recognize a desperate bluff. But he had also seen the way Silas had just kissed her. That hadn't looked like a bluff. "Inside," Silas ordered gruffly, breaking the tension. "All of you. We have work to do." For the next 4 days, the farmhouse became an isolated fortress. Silas kept his Winchester within arm's reach at all times, patrolling the perimeter from dusk till dawn. But inside the walls, a strange, suffocating domestic intimacy took root. Playing the part of an engaged couple blurred the lines of reality faster than either of them anticipated. In the tight confines of the kitchen, they couldn't avoid each other. It was the accidental brush of Silas's calloused knuckles against Abby's hand when he passed her a coffee cup. It was the way Abby instinctively reached up to straighten his collar before he walked out to check the herd. It was the heavy, lingering looks across the dining table that made the air feel thick and combustible. On the 5th night, the rain came, a violent, sudden prairie thunderstorm that lashed against the windows and trapped them all in the parlor. Abby and Levi were seated at the heavy oak table, illuminated by the warm, flickering halo of a kerosene lamp. Between them lay Elias Montgomery's black leather ledger. "It's a cipher, but a lazy one," Abby murmured, her finger tracing the looping, spidery cursive. "He's not using fake names, just abbreviations for the towns and the officials. Look here, Levi. CS, $500, RB Fire." Levi leaned in, his brow furrowed in concentration. The boy who had shattered an axe handle a week ago was now meticulously decoding a criminal empire. "County Sheriff," Levi sounded out slowly. $500, RB Fire. "The Red Bluff Ranch burned down last month." "Exactly," Abby said, pride swelling in her chest. She looked up. Silas was sitting in the worn leather armchair by the cold hearth, a rag in his hand, methodically oiling the cylinder of his peacemaker. But his pale, striking eyes weren't on the gun. They were locked entirely on Abby. The heat in his gaze was a physical weight. It was the look of a starving man staring at a banquet. Abby's breath caught in her throat. She quickly looked back down at the ledger, her cheeks burning. "If we can decode the last 3 pages, we'll have a direct financial link between Montgomery and the federal land grants he stole. It's enough to hang him twice." "We just have to survive long enough to hand it to Judge Carter," Silas said, his voice a low rumble over the crack of thunder outside. "He crosses into the county in 2.5 weeks. Until then, Montgomery is going to squeeze us." "We can hold out," Levi said fiercely, his chin jutting out. "We've got the house. We've got the guns." Silas stopped oiling his revolver. He looked at the boy. His boy. The feral, terrified orphan from the Caldwell depot was gone. In his place was a son willing to defend his home. "Go on to bed, Levi," Silas said softly. "You too, Daisy. It's late." When the children had disappeared down the hall, the silence in the parlor grew deafening. The rhythmic drumming of the rain on the tin roof only amplified the tension between the 2 adults left in the room. Abby stood up to gather the slate and the ledger. As she reached across the table, Silas stood from his chair. He moved with that silent, predatory grace, closing the distance between them until he was standing just inches away. Abby froze, her hand resting on the leather cover of the book. She looked up. Silas towered over her, smelling of gun oil, rain, and raw masculinity. "Abby," he murmured, his voice incredibly rough. She swallowed hard, her pulse hammering wildly against her throat. We should keep reading. The timeline." Silas reached out, his large hand covering hers on top of the ledger. His skin was rough, calloused from years of hard labor and violence. But his touch was agonizingly gentle. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, looking down at her lips, the memory of their desperate kiss hanging in the air between them like a lit fuse. Abby closed her eyes, leaning infinitesimally toward him, completely helpless against the magnetic pull of the man who had turned his home into her fortress. A sharp crack of lightning illuminated the room, breaking the spell. Silas stepped back, his chest heaving as he fought a brutal war against his own control. "I need to check the horses," he muttered, grabbing his hat and plunging out the back door into the driving rain. Abby stood alone in the kitchen, pressing her trembling fingers to her lips, realizing with terrifying clarity that she wasn't acting anymore. She was completely, irrevocably, in love with Silas Thorne. The rain cleared by midnight, leaving the prairie air crisp and bone-chillingly cold. Silas didn't go back into the house. He couldn't. Being near Abby, smelling the sweet lilac of her skin, and knowing he couldn't touch her was a unique kind of torture. Instead, he went to the far end of the barn, where he kept a small, coal-fired forge he used for farrier work. He pumped the bellows, watching the coals glow from a dull, angry red to a brilliant, searing orange. Silas opened a small wooden box on his workbench. Inside lay a rusted, square-headed iron horseshoe nail. It was from the first Mustang he had ever broken. back when he was a bitter, violent youth trying to outrun the ghosts of the orphan train. He took a pair of heavy iron tongs, gripped the nail, and thrust it deep into the glowing coals. Silas Thorne was a man who didn't believe in miracles, but as he watched the iron heat up, he thought about the woman sleeping in his spare room. He thought about the fierce, lioness courage he had shown staring down Elias Montgomery. He thought about how she looked at Levi, not as a broken burden, but as a boy worth saving. "I am Silas Thorne's fiancé." The words echoed in his mind. It had been a lie to save the boy's life. But as Silas pulled the glowing, malleable iron from the fire and laid it across the horn of his small anvil, he knew exactly what he was doing. He raised his blacksmithing hammer. Clang! He struck the hot iron, bending the head of the nail slightly. Clang! He struck it again, curving the metal with slow, deliberate precision. He wasn't a jeweler. He was a rancher and a retired gunfighter. But he poured every ounce of his unspoken devotion into that piece of rough iron. He hammered it, heated it, and curved it until the ends overlapped, forming a rugged, perfectly circular band. Silas picked it up with the tongs and plunged it into a bucket of cold water. It hissed violently, sending a plume of white steam into the cold barn air. When he pulled it out, he wiped the soot away with his thumb. It was a crude, heavy ring, unpolished, scarred, and strong enough to withstand a lifetime of hard labor. It looked exactly like the man who made it. Silas stared at the ring in the palm of his hand, a heavy, suffocating wave of emotion crashing over him. He was going to ask Abigail Stanton to marry him. For real. Not for the state inspector, not for the law, but because the thought of waking up in a world where she wasn't his made his blood run cold. He curled his fist around the cold iron, a rare, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. Outside the barn, the wind shifted. Silas's smile vanished. His head snapped up, his nostrils flaring. The smell of coal smoke and hot iron was suddenly overpowered by something else. Something pungent, chemical, and distinctly unnatural out on the open prairie. Kerosene. Silas dropped the ring into his pocket and grabbed the Winchester leaning against the anvil. He moved silently to the crack in the heavy wooden barn doors and peered out into the pitch-black yard. Shadows were moving. 4 men dressed in dark dusters were creeping along the perimeter of the farmhouse. They moved with practiced, deadly silence, carrying heavy metal jerry cans. Silas watched in frozen horror as one of the men splashed a thick, dark arc of liquid across the wooden base of the wraparound porch, right beneath the window of the room where Abby and Daisy were sleeping. Another man was doing the same to the dry, weathered wood of the barn. Montgomery hadn't come for the ledger. He hadn't come for the boy. He had come to burn the broken spur to the ground with everyone inside it. In the dark, 50 yards away, Silas saw the sudden, terrifying flare of a struck match. The tiny, sulphurous flare of the match was the brightest thing in the pitch-black Kansas night. Silas Thorne didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. He simply raised the Winchester, leveled the sights through the crack in the barn doors, and squeezed the trigger. Crack! The rifle shot shattered the stillness, echoing like a cannon blast across the open prairie. The man holding the match jerked backward, clutching his shattered shoulder. But the damage was already done. The lit match tumbled from his fingers, hitting the kerosene-soaked dirt. Whoosh! A blinding, ferocious wall of orange flame erupted instantly, racing in 2 terrifying directions. One ribbon of fire shot up the dry, weathered wood of the barn. The other tore across the yard, climbing the wooden lattice of the farmhouse porch, right below the window, where Abigail and Daisy were sleeping. "Abby! Fire!" Silas roared, his voice tearing from his throat. He kicked the heavy barn doors open. The sudden rush of oxygen fed the inferno, the flames roaring with a deafening, hungry intensity. Inside the barn, the horses began to scream, a high-pitched, terrifying sound of pure, trapped panic. Silas sprinted down the center aisle, plunging into the thickening, acrid smoke. He threw open the stall doors, slapping the rumps of the terrified quarter horses and mustangs, driving them out into the open yard. The heat was already blistering, the air superheated and choking. Inside the farmhouse, chaos erupted. Abby jolted awake to the smell of smoke and the frantic glow of orange light through her window. She threw off the quilt, sprinting across the hall to grab a crying Daisy from her bed. "Levi!" Abby screamed over the roar of the fire, dragging Daisy toward the kitchen. "Levi, we have to get out!" But Levi's room was empty. The boy had woken to the gunshot. He had looked out his window and seen the barn, a massive two-story structure of dry pine and hay, fully engulfed in roaring flames. And he knew Silas was inside. Levi hadn't run away from the danger. He had bolted out the back door, sprinting across the illuminated yard in his bare feet, diving through the open barn doors, just as the loft caught fire. "Silas!" Levi screamed, coughing as the thick black smoke filled his lungs. "Levi, get out!" Silas bellowed from the back stall, driving the last mare toward the exit. "Get out of here!" But before Levi could turn, the massive central support beam of the hayloft, eaten through by the kerosene-fueled fire, gave way. Crack, boom! The sound was apocalyptic. The heavy timber crashed down, sending a geyser of sparks and burning debris into the center aisle, completely blocking the exit. For Silas, it was a terrifying obstacle. But for 13-year-old Levi, the sound of the groaning, collapsing timber triggered a psychological landmine. It sounded exactly like the Colorado silver mine. It was the exact deafening roar of the wooden supports giving way. The collapse that had crushed his father and buried him alive. Levi froze. His eyes dilated, locking onto the burning wood. He wasn't in Kansas anymore. He was back in the suffocating dark of the mine. The boy dropped to his knees, his hands flying up to cover his ears, his chest heaving in a violent, paralyzing panic attack. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He was waiting to be buried. "Levi!" Silas saw the boy drop. He saw the blank, terrified shock on Levi's face, and he saw the roof of the barn beginning to bow inward, a sea of fire preparing to collapse directly on top of him. A 10-foot wall of roaring flames separated them. Silas didn't think about his own life. He didn't think about the heat. He stripped off his heavy canvas duster, plunged it into the half-full water trough, and charged straight into the inferno. He dove through the wall of fire. The searing heat instantly blistered the skin on his forearms and the side of his face, but he didn't stop. He hit the ground sliding, reaching the paralyzed boy, just as a shower of burning embers rained down from the ceiling. Silas threw the wet, heavy canvas coat completely over Levi, pulling the boy tight against his chest, shielding him with his own massive body. "I've got you!" Silas roared over the deafening fire, hauling the trembling boy to his feet. "You are not dying today. Walk with me!" Another beam crashed down, the jagged, burning edge grazing Silas's right shoulder blade. The pain was blinding, an agonizing sear that made his vision go white, but his grip on Levi never loosened. Using his own body as a battering ram against the burning debris, Silas barreled through the flaming threshold and burst out into the cool night air. They collapsed into the dirt of the yard, rolling away from the intense heat, just as the entire roof of the barn caved in with a spectacular, earth-shaking explosion of sparks and ash. Abby was there a second later, having doused the porch fire with buckets from the pump. She fell to her knees in the dirt beside them, her face streaked with soot and tears, pulling Daisy with her. Levi pushed the scorched canvas coat off his head. He was coughing violently, his chest heaving, but he was unharmed. He looked at the towering inferno of the collapsed barn, and then he looked down at Silas. The rancher was on his hands and knees, fighting for breath, the back of his shirt burned away, his shoulder a mess of blistered, bleeding skin. Silas had literally walked through fire for him. He hadn't thrown him away. He hadn't left him behind. The last reinforced wall around Levi's battered heart shattered into a million pieces. The boy threw his arms around Silas's neck, burying his face in the man's soot-stained chest, his small body shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. "You came back," Levi wept, his fingers digging into Silas's shirt. "You came back for me, Dad." "Back for?" The word hit Silas harder than the burning timber. "Dad." Silas closed his eyes, ignoring the agonizing pain in his back. and wrapped his arms fiercely around his son. "Always," Silas choked out, kissing the top of the boy's head. "I will always come back for you." Abby knelt beside them, wrapping her arms around both of them, burying her face in Silas's uninjured shoulder as the barn burned to ash against the black prairie sky. Dawn broke over the broken spur in bruised shades of gray and violet. The barn was nothing but a smoldering, blackened foundation. The horses were corralled in the western paddock, spooked but alive. Inside the kitchen, the air was heavy and quiet. Silas sat bare-chested backward on a wooden dining chair, his arms resting on the top rung. The right side of his back and his shoulder were an angry, blistered red. Abby stood behind him, a jar of medicinal burn salve in her trembling hands. The kids were asleep in the parlor, exhausted from the trauma of the night. It was just the two of them. Abby scooped a cool layer of the salve onto her fingers and gently, agonizingly, carefully, began to apply it to Silas's burned skin. Silas hissed through his teeth, his muscles going rigid. "I'm sorry," Abby whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I know it hurts." "It's not the burn," Silas rasped. His head bowed. He took a ragged breath. "When I saw that match drop, when I saw the fire climbing the house toward your window, Abby, I have never been so terrified in my entire life." Abby stopped. She rested her clean hand on his uninjured shoulder, stepping closer until her waist brushed his back. "We're safe, Silas. You saved us." "I can't lose you," he confessed, the rough, violent rancher entirely stripped of his armor, leaving nothing but raw, bleeding vulnerability. He slowly turned his head to look at her, his pale eyes burning with an intensity that rivaled the fire they had just survived. "I survived losing my wife because I had to for Daisy. But if I lost you, Abby, it would kill me." A tear slipped down Abby's soot-stained cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She moved around the chair, stepping between his parted knees. She reached up, cupping his rough, unshaven jaw in both her hands. "Then it's a good thing I'm not going anywhere," Abby whispered fiercely. "I love you, Silas Thorne. I am entirely, hopelessly in love with you." Silas let out a breath that sounded like a prayer. He reached into the pocket of his discarded scorched trousers on the table. He pulled out the crude, heavy iron ring he had forged from the horseshoe nail just hours before the world caught fire. He took her left hand, pressing the cold iron into her palm. "I made this last night," Silas murmured, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "It's not gold. It's not pretty. But it's iron. It won't break and it won't melt, just like us. Make the lie a reality, Abby. Marry me." Abby looked down at the rugged piece of iron. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She let out a watery, breathless laugh, her fingers closing tightly around it. "Yes, yes, Silas, I will." Thunder. The sound wasn't in the sky. It was in the earth. The heavy, rhythmic drumming of dozens of galloping horses vibrating through the floorboards of the farmhouse. Silas's head snapped toward the window. The tender, intimate peace shattered instantly. He stood up, ignoring the screaming pain in his back, and grabbed his Colt peacemaker from the table. Through the kitchen window, the morning mist was parting. Elias Montgomery was riding into the center of the scorched yard. But this time, he wasn't hiding behind the cover of darkness, and he hadn't brought a corrupt inspector. He had brought 20 heavily armed men, rifles drawn and leveled directly at the farmhouse. "Thorne!" Montgomery's voice bellowed across the yard, dripping with lethal finality. "The games are over. Bring out the ledger, or we finish what the fire started." The 20 armed men formed a semicircle of lethal intent around the scorched yard of the broken spur, their lever-action rifles leveled directly at the farmhouse windows. Inside the kitchen, Silas Thorne didn't flinch. His mind shifted gears, dropping instantly into the cold, calculating void that had kept him alive during his gunfighting days. If the shooting started now, the thin wooden walls of the farmhouse would be shredded like paper. He could take down 5, maybe 6 of Montgomery's men, but the return fire would slaughter Abigail, Levi, and Daisy. That was an unacceptable calculus. Silas, Abby breathed, her hand gripping his forearm, her eyes wide with terror. Don't go out there. Silas looked down at her. Down. He reached up, his thumb brushing a smudge of soot from her cheek. I promised I'd protect this family, he said, his voice a low, immovable stone. Lock the door behind me. Get the kids on the floor. Before she could protest, Silas grabbed the black leather ledger from the table, wrapped it tightly in a piece of canvas, and stepped out onto the front porch. The morning air was thick with the smell of wet ash from the ruined barn. Silas stood at the top of the stairs, utterly unarmed save for the peacemaker in his holster. He didn't raise his hands. He held the canvas-wrapped package out over the porch rail. Elias Montgomery sat atop a magnificent dappled gray stallion, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the hired killers flanking him. He smiled, a thin, triumphant slash across his aristocratic face. "A wise choice, Thorne," Montgomery called out. "Toss it over." "If a single bullet strikes this house, my hand opens and this book drops into the burn barrel right beside me," Silas lied smoothly, nodding to the smoldering ash can at the edge of the porch. "It burns, and you lose the only record of your empire." Montgomery's smile vanished. His eyes narrowed. He needed that ledger intact. If it was destroyed, the financial knots he'd tied with the corrupt officials would unravel into chaos. "What do you want, Thorne?" Montgomery spat. "I want the town to see you," Silas declared, his voice carrying over the wind. "I'm not handing this over in the dirt like a thief. I will ride into Caldwell, high noon, the Golden Nugget Saloon, just you and me at a table. I hand you the book, and you give your word in front of the whole town that the Broken Spur and everyone on it is off limits." Montgomery studied the rugged, burned rancher. He let out a cold, dismissive laugh. A public surrender. Silas Thorne walking into town like a whipped dog to hand over his only leverage. It appealed directly to Montgomery's massive ego. It would cement his absolute power over Caldwell forever. "High noon, Thorne," Montgomery agreed, hauling his stallion around. "If you are 1 minute late, my men will ride back here and leave nothing but graves." The posse rode out. Silas turned and walked back inside. The moment the door latched, Abby was there, her face pale. "Silas, you can't go. It's a trap. Once he has the ledger in a room full of his men, he'll kill you anyway." "I know," Silas said evenly. He walked to the bedroom, pulling a clean black shirt over his blistered, agonizing back. He strapped his gun belt around his hips, tying the leather thongs down around his thigh. He checked the cylinder of the peacemaker. 6 rounds. He looked at Levi, who was standing by the hallway, his fists clenched in helpless rage. "Levi, saddle my black gelding." Dad, no." "Do it, son," Silas commanded gently. When Levi ran out the back door, Silas turned to Abby. "I need you to listen to me. Judge Carter's circuit train is scheduled to pass through the neighboring county tomorrow, but it takes on water at the Caldwell Depot at 11:30 this morning. If he's on it, you have a window." Abby's eyes widened as the strategy clicked into place. "You're not surrendering the ledger. You're buying time." "I'm keeping 20 guns pointed at me instead of you," Silas corrected, stepping close and pressing a hard, desperate kiss to her forehead. "Take the buckboard. Take the back trail into town. Find the judge. If I don't make it out of that saloon, you give him this." He pressed the canvas-wrapped ledger into her hands. Abby stared at it. Then she looked down at her left hand where the heavy iron horseshoe nail ring rested on her finger. A fierce, terrifying resolve hardened in her hazel eyes. She wasn't a victim running in the dark anymore. She was a rancher's wife. "You make it out of that saloon, Silas Thorne," Abby vowed, her voice trembling with absolute certainty, "or I will burn it down myself." High noon in Caldwell was a sweltering, breathless affair. The dust hung stagnant in the streets. The townsfolk had cleared out, peeking nervously through the shuttered windows of the mercantile and the assayer's office. They all knew what was coming. Silas Thorne rode slowly down Main Street. He didn't look left or right. His broad shoulders were squared. his pale eyes fixed on the bat-wing doors of the Golden Nugget Saloon. The rhythmic, metallic ching-ching-ching of his spurs echoed like a death knell as he dismounted and stepped onto the wooden boardwalk. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with the stench of stale beer, cheap cigar smoke, and nervous sweat. The piano was dead silent. The bartender had vanished into the cellar. Elias Montgomery sat at a round poker table in the center of the room, a glass of amber whiskey in his hand. The corrupt local sheriff stood to his right. Cullen and half a dozen heavily armed enforcers lined the walls, their hands hovering near their holsters. Silas pushed through the swinging doors. The silence in the room deepened, becoming a physical, suffocating pressure. Silas walked slowly to the table. He didn't sit. He reached into his coat and tossed a canvas-wrapped package onto the green felt. It landed with a heavy, muted thud. It was a dummy package filled with old farming catalogs, but Montgomery didn't know that yet. "There it is," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried to every dark corner of the room. "The blood money you stole from the ranchers of this county." Montgomery smiled lazily, setting down his whiskey glass. "Very dramatic, Thorne, but ultimately meaningless. You see, the law in Caldwell is what I say it is." He nodded to the sweating sheriff. "Isn't that right, Sheriff?" "Yes, sir, Mr. Montgomery," the lawman muttered, refusing to meet Silas's eyes. "You don't own the law," Silas said quietly, his right hand hanging loose and relaxed by his thigh. "You just rent the cheap parts of it." Montgomery's smile vanished. His aristocratic face twisted with sudden ugly malice. He had the package. He had the town. He didn't need the rancher anymore. "Kill him," Montgomery ordered softly to his men. But Silas Thorne was a ghost from a much more violent era. Before Cullen or any of the enforcers could even clear their weapons from leather, Montgomery decided to take the glory himself. The Baron's hand darted beneath the poker table, pulling a silver-plated, double-barreled Derringer from a hidden vest holster, aiming it directly upward at Silas's stomach. Time seemed to fracture, slowing to an agonizing crawl. Silas's instincts, honed by years of surviving the worst men in the West, took over. He didn't draw to kill. He drew to disarm. His right hand was a blur of motion. The Colt Peacemaker cleared the holster, the hammer already cocked back by his thumb. Bang! The explosive roar of the .45 caliber round in the enclosed saloon was deafening. Montgomery shrieked. He didn't fall dead. Instead, the heavy bullet struck the silver Derringer in his hand with pinpoint mathematical precision. The sheer kinetic force shattered the small gun into pieces, ripping it violently from Montgomery's grip and sending a spray of metal fragments into the wooden table. Montgomery fell backward out of his chair, clutching his numb, bruised hand, his eyes wide with absolute paralyzed shock. Cullen and the enforcers froze, their guns halfway out of their holsters, staring at the man who had just outdrawn a hidden weapon without shedding a drop of blood. Silas stood like a statue sculpted from gun smoke, the Peacemaker leveled directly at the center of the room. "The next man who clears leather," Silas warned, his voice deadly calm over the ringing in their ears, "gets a bullet in his heart. Drop them." For 2 breathless seconds, no one moved. Then the bat-wing doors of the saloon burst open with a violent crash. The blinding midday sun poured into the smoky room, and standing in the center of the light was Abigail Stanton. She wasn't alone. Flanking her on the boardwalk was Levi, holding Silas's Winchester rifle, his jaw set with fierce determination. Behind them stood a crowd of over 30 Caldwell townsfolk, the blacksmith, the mercantile owner, the farmers who had been squeezed for months, all holding shotguns, pitchforks, and axes. And stepping through the doors, parting the crowd with an air of absolute unquestionable authority, was a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and a tailored black coat. Pinned to the lapels of the 3 severe-looking men walking behind him were the silver stars of United States Marshals. "I am Federal Judge Carter," the silver-haired man boomed, his voice echoing like thunder in the stunned saloon. "And this establishment is surrounded." Montgomery, still on the floor, went entirely pale. He looked at the fake canvas package on the table, suddenly realizing how thoroughly he had been outplayed. Abby stepped past the marshals, her skirt swishing over the dusty floorboards. She walked straight up to the poker table, carrying the real black leather ledger. She slammed it down onto the green felt, right next to Montgomery's shattered derringer. "Here is your proof, Your Honor," Abby said, her hazel eyes blazing as she looked down at the ruined land baron. "A complete record of extortion, arson, and bribery, maintained by Elias Montgomery." Judge Carter picked up the ledger, flipping through the pages. His expression darkened with judicial fury. He looked up at the corrupt local sheriff, who had just dropped his gun belt to the floor in surrender. "Marshals," Judge Carter ordered. "Arrest Mr. Montgomery and his men. Strip that sheriff of his badge. If any of them resist, you have my authorization to shoot them where they stand." The saloon erupted into a flurry of motion as the U.S. Marshals moved in, disarming Cullen and dragging a cursing, humiliated Elias Montgomery to his feet in irons. Through the chaos, Silas holstered his peacemaker. His hands were shaking, the adrenaline finally crashing out of his system, leaving behind the searing agony of his burned back and the overwhelming, crushing weight of relief. He looked across the poker table. Abby was staring at him, tears of profound relief streaming down her face. She didn't care about the crowd, the marshals, or the judge. She launched herself across the short distance, throwing her arms around Silas's neck. Silas caught her, burying his face in her auburn hair, holding her so tightly he thought he might break her. He breathed in the scent of lilac and Kansas dust, anchoring himself to the woman who had just saved his life. A small, solid weight slammed into Silas's side. He opened his eyes to see Levi wrapping his arms around his waist, burying his face in Silas's coat. The boy had dropped the Winchester. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was just a son, holding on to his father. Silas dropped his heavy chin onto Levi's head, his arm wrapping around the boy, holding his entire family together in the middle of the crowded saloon. The gun smoke was clearing. The ghosts of his past were finally dead. And for the first time in his life, Silas Thorne knew exactly what it meant to win. Spring came to the Kansas prairie not with a whisper, but with a vibrant, breathless rush of life. The winter snowmelt had washed away the last lingering streaks of black soot from the broken spur's yard, feeding the earth until it erupted in a sea of sweet blue-stem grass and wild yellow mustard flowers. The rhythmic, steady thwack of a framing hammer echoed in the crisp May air. Silas Thorne stood atop the skeletal roof of the new barn, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of a canvas-gloved hand. The new structure was twice the size of the old one, built with fresh-cut golden pine that smelled of sap and new beginnings. Beneath his cotton shirt, the burn scars on his right shoulder pulled tight, a permanent physical reminder of the fire. But Silas had never felt stronger. He looked down into the yard. A sleek, polished buggy was rolling up the drive. But this time, Silas didn't reach for the Winchester strapped to the scaffolding. He simply set his hammer down and climbed down the wooden ladder. Federal Judge Carter stepped down from the buggy, brushing the dust from his tailored coat. Beside him was a newly appointed, thoroughly vetted state welfare inspector, a woman with kind eyes and a stack of crisp official folders. Abigail stepped out onto the newly built wraparound porch, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. She smiled brightly, walking down the steps to meet them just as Silas reached the buggy. "Judge Carter," Silas greeted, removing his Stetson and shaking the older man's hand. "We didn't expect you out this way until summer. The circuit moves fast when there isn't a corrupt land baron gumming up the dockets, Mr. Thorne," Carter smiled warmly. Elias Montgomery was currently sitting in a federal penitentiary, his empire dismantled and his stolen deeds returned to their rightful owners. Carter turned to the woman beside him. "Mrs. Higgins here has some final paperwork to deliver. I thought I'd personally provide the escort." Silas's heart gave a heavy, hopeful thud. He turned toward the corral. "Levi." The boy had been brushing down the black gelding. He jogged over, tossing the curry comb onto a fence post. He was taller than he had been in August, his shoulders filling out the flannel shirt that actually fit him now. The defensive, feral hunch was gone from his posture, replaced by the easy, confident stride of a rancher's son. Mrs. Higgins smiled at the boy, opening her leather folio. She pulled out a heavy parchment document bearing the embossed gold seal of the state of Kansas. "We don't need to ask you any questions today, young man," Mrs. Higgins said gently. "We just need you to read this." She handed the document to Levi. 6 months ago, the boy would have stared at the paper in angry, humiliated silence. Today, Levi took the parchment, his dark eyes scanning the elegant typed script. His lips didn't move as he read. He processed the words fluidly, his brow furrowing in concentration before his eyes suddenly widened. He looked up, completely stunned, the paper trembling in his hands. "It says..." Levi's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again, looking directly at Silas. "It says Levi Thorne, legally recognized son of Silas Thorne." "It's finalized, son," Silas said, his voice thick with a raw, overwhelming pride. He placed a heavy, calloused hand on Levi's shoulder, squeezing firmly. "Nobody can ever take you away. You're a Thorne now, permanently." Levi stared at the paper, a brilliant, unburdened smile breaking across his face, a genuine, radiant expression that reached all the way to his dark eyes. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He just folded the paper carefully, tucking it into his shirt pocket right over his heart, and leaned into Silas's side. Judge Carter tipped his hat to Abby. "I believe congratulations are in order for the entire family. I'll see you both in town next week." When the buggy rolled away, Levi ran off to find Daisy by the creek to tell her the news, his boots kicking up joyful clouds of dust. Silas turned to Abby. The midday sun caught the auburn highlights in her hair, illuminating the profound, peaceful happiness radiating from her face. She was no longer a widow on the run. She was the absolute center of gravity for the broken spur. "Well," Abby murmured, stepping close and resting her hands on his chest, her fingers tracing the line of his suspenders. "Levi Thorne. It has a wonderful ring to it." "It does," Silas agreed softly. His pale eyes darkened, shifting from paternal pride to a deep, simmering heat that made Abby's breath catch. "But there's one piece of paperwork left to file." That evening, the Kansas sky ignited into a breathtaking canvas of fiery orange, deep violet, and bruised magenta. The kids had eaten supper and were playing out in the yard, catching the season's first fireflies in a glass mason jar. Silas stepped out onto the porch, having washed the day's dust from his skin and changed into a clean canvas shirt. Abby was sitting on the wooden porch swing, a patchwork quilt draped over her lap against the cool spring breeze. She looked up, her hazel eyes softening perfectly as he approached. Silas didn't sit beside her. He stopped in front of the swing. He reached into his pocket, his large fingers closing over the heavy, unpolished iron ring he had forged in the fires of the darkest night of their lives. He had given it to her on a morning of terror and ash, a desperate promise made to secure a legal fiction. She wore it every day on a leather cord around her neck, hidden beneath her collar, waiting for the dust to truly settle. "Abby," Silas began, his gravelly voice dropping to a low, intimate register that commanded the very air around them. He slowly lowered his tall, imposing frame, dropping down onto one knee on the wooden floorboards. Abby gasped softly, her hands flying to her mouth. Silas reached out, gently taking her left hand in his. His thumb brushed over her knuckles. "When I brought you to this ranch, it was to keep you safe. When we told that inspector we were engaged, it was a lie to save my son. But Abigail, there hasn't been a single lie in my heart since the day you walked into my kitchen." Tears welled in Abby's eyes, shimmering in the twilight. "I'm a hard man," Silas confessed, his pale eyes locked onto hers with absolute naked devotion. "I've got scars, and I've got a past that isn't pretty. But I love you. I love you with every beat of my heart and every breath in my lungs. I want to build a life with you that isn't about surviving. I want a life about living." He pulled the heavy iron horseshoe nail ring from his pocket. "Take this off the necklace, Abby. Put it on your hand. Marry me. For real this time." A tear slipped down Abby's cheek, but her smile was as bright as the morning sun. She didn't hesitate. She reached down, pulling the leather cord from over her head, sliding the iron ring free. She held it out to him. She held it out to... Silas took it, his massive, scarred hands trembling just slightly as he slid the cool, heavy iron onto her left ring finger. It was a perfect fit. "Yes," Abby whispered, sliding off the swing and dropping to her knees right there on the porch to throw her arms around his neck. "Yes, Silas. 1,000 times, yes." He caught her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, and captured her lips in a deep, sweeping kiss that tasted of sweet prairie wind and absolute certainty. There was no desperation in it this time, no fear of the encroaching dark. It was a promise, sealed in iron and forged in fire. A sudden, bright giggle broke them apart. Silas and Abby looked up, still holding on to each other. A few yards away, sitting on the bottom step of the porch beneath the warm glow of the hanging lantern, was Levi. Daisy was tucked securely under his arm, her head resting on his shoulder, holding the jar of glowing fireflies. Levi had a thick, leather-bound book resting open on his knees. It wasn't a ledger of crimes and extortions. It was a copy of Treasure Island, bought brand new from the Mercantile in Caldwell. The boy who had once believed the world was entirely made of cruelty and locked doors cleared his throat. He ran his finger under the first line of the page, his voice ringing out clear, steady, and full of life into the quiet Kansas night. "Squire Trelawney, Dr. Livesey, and the rest of these gentlemen having asked me to write down the whole particulars about Treasure Island." Silas stood up, pulling Abby up with him, wrapping his arm securely around his soon-to-be wife's waist. He listened to the steady cadence of his son's voice, watching his daughter look up at her big brother with complete, unwavering adoration. He thought about the Caldwell depot. He thought about the suffocating coal smoke, the terrifying vulnerability in a battered orphan's eyes, and the little girl who had refused to look away. "Dad, can we bring him home?" 4 words had shattered a lifetime of armor. 4 words had reached into the darkest, most painful corners of Silas Thorne's soul and dragged him back into the light. Silas pulled Abby closer, resting his chin against her auburn hair, as he looked out over the sprawling, peaceful expanse of the Broken Spur Ranch. They were all home. And the story was just beginning. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.